In the heart of the Mediterranean, there lay an island no larger than a speck on most maps. Malta. To sailors it was a beacon, to generals it was a prize, and to the Axis powers in 1942 it was an obstacle that had to be erased. Its limestone cliffs and sun-bleached towns hid a truth far larger than its size. Malta was the hinge upon which the war in the Mediterranean would turn. Whoever commanded its skies and harbours commanded the sea routes that fed the North African front. The year was 1940 when the first shadows passed over the island's golden horizon. At dawn, black crosses cut across the sun as Heinkel and Junkers bombers appeared overhead. The first bombs struck Valletta's Grand Harbour, and the Second World War had come to Malta. Within hours, smoke rose above the domes of churches and the ancient walls of the Knights of St. John. Few on the island understood then that this would be the beginning of one of the longest and most brutal sieges in modern history. Malta's importance could not be overstated. Positioned halfway between Gibraltar and Alexandria, it stood astride the main artery of Axis supply lines. Every convoy bound for Rommel's Africa Corps in North Africa had to pass within striking distance of the island's aircraft and submarines. From airfields carved into rock, British reconnaissance pilots could shadow Italian and German shipping, directing attacks that bled Axis logistics dry. For Hitler and Mussolini, Malta became a thorn too deep to ignore. By 1941, Axis command was united on a single objective. Malta must fall. Field Marshal Erwin Rommel himself pressed the point. Without Malta, he warned, the Axis will end by losing control of North Africa. Hitler agreed, and the Luftwaffe's Mediterranean commander, Albert Kesselring, received new orders. Neutralize Malta by air power alone. No invasion would be needed if the island could simply be pounded into dust. The campaign began with cold precision. From airfields in Sicily, waves of Messerschmitt Bf-109s swept ahead of squadrons of bombers, clearing the skies before each attack. The island's defenders, flying aging Hawker Hurricanes and worn-out Gladiators, rose to meet them. The first encounters were desperate. Against the speed and firepower of the German fighters, the Hurricanes were outclassed. RAF pilots fought not for victory but survival, darting through clouds of flak and debris to defend what little remained of their airfields. Valletta and its harbours bore the brunt. Day after day, the Luftwaffe's raids carved scars through the ancient city. The limestone streets ran with dust, and the once proud bastions of the Knights crumbled under the weight of high explosives. The Maltese people, farmers, dockworkers and fishermen, found themselves living under a sky that never cleared. Each dawn brought the wail of air raid sirens, each night the rumble of engines returning for another strike. Yet through hunger and exhaustion, the island refused to yield. By early 1942, the Axis intensified its efforts. Entire formations of Junkers Ju-88 bombers turned the sky silver in the morning light. The noise was unending, echoing through the caves and tunnels where thousands of civilians now lived. Valletta's ancient catacombs became homes, shelters and hospitals. Children grew up underground, their first memories the thunder of bombs and the acrid taste of dust. In 1 week alone, more than 1,000 sorties rained devastation upon the docks and airfields. The British command in Cairo and London watched with alarm. Malta was more than a fortress. It was a lifeline for the Royal Navy's operations in the Mediterranean. If the island fell, Allied shipping to Egypt would be crippled, and Rommel's supply lines to the desert would run unchallenged. Churchill called Malta an unsinkable aircraft carrier. Losing it would mean losing the Central Sea. But the situation grew dire. Fuel and food were running out. The RAF squadrons on the island had been reduced to a handful of operational planes, most patched together from wreckage. Spare parts were scavenged from crashed aircraft. Ground crews worked under bombardment, refueling and rearming whatever could still fly. In January 1942 alone, Malta endured over 200 air raids. The Hurricanes were being destroyed faster than they could be repaired, and for every bomber shot down, several more came to take its place. Despite the pressure, morale among the defenders held. The Maltese and the RAF men shared everything: shelters, rations, cigarettes, and danger. Pilots often described looking down from their cockpits to see civilians waving from shattered rooftops as they took off to intercept yet another raid. The people refused to be broken. Even as the Axis believed Malta's fall was inevitable, its spirit remained unbowed. Every raid deepened the determination to fight back. Ground observers learned to spot the shapes of enemy aircraft by their engine sounds. Anti-aircraft gunners, using equipment older than many of the pilots, became frighteningly accurate. The narrow runways, cratered by bombs, were repaired again and again by volunteer crews. Each time a hurricane roared skyward, the island's heart lifted. Each time one failed to return, a small ceremony was held in the flickering light of underground chapels. For the Luftwaffe, Malta seemed a riddle. Despite their superiority in numbers, despite the constant bombings, the British fighter defence would not vanish. They could destroy hangars and fuel depots, but somehow more planes always appeared. What the Germans could not see was the resolve that burned through the rubble, the belief that Malta could endure anything, even annihilation. By the end of March, however, the cost was unbearable. With each new attack, the island's air strength dwindled further. There were days when only a single aircraft could take off to meet entire formations of enemy bombers. The Hurricanes that remained were outdated, their machine guns often jamming from overuse. Ground crews salvaged engines from wrecks, praying for reinforcements that never seemed to arrive. Supplies were now so scarce that pilots limited flying time to save fuel. The siege had become a slow strangulation, and yet, even in this grim hour, hope flickered. Word spread among the airmen that something new was coming. Sleeker, faster fighters that could match the German Messerschmitts in speed and climb. The rumours spoke of Spitfires, Britain's finest machines, capable of turning the tide if they could only reach the island. Every man on Malta, from the pilots to the civilians sheltering beneath the city, understood that their survival depended on those new wings arriving soon. As April approached, the island stood at the edge of defeat. Entire neighbourhoods of Valletta were gone. Airfields lay pocked with craters. Food supplies were nearly exhausted, and the Axis command believed victory was certain. Yet beneath the rubble, Malta still lived, its defenders still watching the skies, waiting for the moment when help would come from over the horizon. The world beyond Malta's shores could scarcely imagine the scale of its suffering, but within those narrow runways and coastal cliffs, history was preparing for a reversal that would astonish the Axis and inspire the Allies. The battle for Malta had not yet reached its climax. The storm was about to change direction. The skies above the Mediterranean in early 1942 shimmered with sunlight, yet over Malta that same brightness revealed nothing but devastation. Craters pocked the airfields, the smell of burnt aviation fuel hung thick, and across the battered island, exhausted men and women awaited the next incoming wave. The Luftwaffe was relentless, and now its assault reached a level unseen since the Blitz over London. Malta, once an outpost of defiance, was being systematically suffocated from the air. Field Marshal Albert Kesselring had been handpicked by Hitler to seize air supremacy across the southern Mediterranean. His orders were unequivocal: Malta must be crushed. To achieve this, he summoned the most experienced Luftwaffe units from the Eastern Front, battle-hardened pilots accustomed to victory. They arrived in Sicily confident that within weeks they would wipe Malta's airfields from existence. The air campaign that began in January 1942 was carefully orchestrated. Day raids by Juncker's Ju-80s and Stuka dive bombers would tear into harbours and airstrips. Night missions by Heinkel He-11s would finish the job, leaving no time for recovery. The first strikes were precision assaults against Tarkali and Lucca airfields, the heart of Malta's defensive network. Each dawn, squadrons of Bf-19s streaked across the sea at treetop height before climbing to altitude. They were fast, agile, and devastatingly effective. The Hurricanes that met them were outmatched in speed, range, and climb rate. Veteran German pilots quickly learned to bait the defenders into dogfights they could never win. Spiralling above the island, contrails twisted into ribbons as engines screamed and tracers cut the air like threads of fire. On the ground, the consequences were ruinous. Each day's bombardment left runways cratered, hangars shattered, and workshops in ruins. Aircraft that survived combat often landed amid explosions, tires shredded, wings clipped by debris. Mechanics worked through the night with no light but oil lamps, patching bullet holes with tin and canvas. Fuel stores were buried under tons of rock to hide them from enemy reconnaissance, yet even those secret caches were discovered and destroyed. The Luftwaffe's confidence swelled with every mission. Reconnaissance photos sent back to Kesselring's headquarters showed Valletta's Grand Harbour transformed into a wasteland of wreckage. Smoke trailed for miles across the sea, visible even from Sicily. German radio broadcasts declared that Malta was finished, its defenders broken. Yet even as the Axis pilots congratulated themselves, a few Hurricanes still clawed into the sky each day, refusing to abandon their post. Among the men who flew in those early months was Flight Lieutenant Adrian Warburton, a reconnaissance pilot whose daring photographic missions became legend. Flying low over Axis convoys, often skimming the waves, Warburton returned with images vital for Allied planners. His Spitfire PR-4 was unarmed, relying entirely on speed and nerve to survive. On one sortie, his aircraft returned riddled with holes, the camera intact, but the tail almost severed. His crew joked that Malta's luck seemed bound to that single man's courage. In truth, every pilot who took off from the island shared that same fatalistic bravery. The intensity of the Luftwaffe's campaign escalated through February. Some raids brought over 100 bombers escorted by dozens of fighters. The assault was unending. By dawn, the rumble of engines grew from the north. By dusk, the island's defenders were too exhausted even to count the sorties. Civilians watched from shelters carved deep into limestone cliffs as their world vanished above. In the catacombs of Rabat, whole families slept in darkness while anti-aircraft guns barked through the night. Children drew pictures of airplanes and searchlights on the damp walls. For the British command, each report from Malta grew more desperate. Replacement aircraft sent by convoy were being sunk before arrival. Every crate of ammunition and gallon of fuel became priceless. Messages to London pleaded for more fighters, more parts, more men, but the Royal Navy itself was stretched thin across half the globe. The island's survival was now in the hands of fewer than 3 squadrons of pilots, most of whom had flown far beyond the limits of endurance. On the 15th of February, Kesselring launched what he believed would be the decisive blow. The entire weight of his Luftwaffe descended on Malta's airfields. From dawn until sunset, bombs fell in continuous waves. Each explosion sent columns of dust towering into the sky. Pilots waiting in dispersal huts could feel the ground tremble beneath them. When the order finally came to scramble, they tore down the damaged runway, engines sputtering, taking to the air through clouds of debris. Hurricanes clawed upwards, only to meet swarms of Messerschmitts. Within minutes, dogfights spread across the island's perimeter, the noise of machine guns mixing with the boom of falling ordnance. Despite overwhelming odds, several RAF pilots achieved remarkable feats. Squadron leader Stan Turner, a veteran from the Battle of Britain, scored 2 confirmed kills in one sortie before his Hurricane was shot to pieces. He bailed out over the sea and was pulled from the water by Maltese fishermen who had watched the entire engagement unfold above them. Turner returned to duty that same afternoon, his uniform still soaked with salt water. Such resilience was common. Rest was a luxury none could afford. Through March and into April, the bombing reached apocalyptic levels. By day, the island burned. By night, it glowed red from fires that refused to die. Valletta's hospitals overflowed. The Maltese worked side by side with RAF ground crews, clearing rubble to keep the runways functional. With each air raid, the number of serviceable fighters dwindled. There came mornings when the control tower reported only a single aircraft ready to fly. On some days, there were none at all. The Luftwaffe's pilots grew complacent. After every major assault, Kesselring's staff reported victory to Berlin. He sent confident communiques to Hitler, claiming the RAF in Malta had been annihilated. German crews painted kill tallies on their aircraft and toasted to the destruction of the island fortress. Yet even in triumph, small cracks began to appear. Losses among bomber squadrons were mounting. Flak batteries hidden among the cliffs had grown increasingly accurate, and the journey across the Mediterranean exposed the aircraft to British submarines and naval patrols. The battle for Malta was proving far more expensive than anticipated. Meanwhile, the British strategists in Cairo began planning their counterstroke. They understood that Malta could only survive if modern fighters arrived to replace the exhausted Hurricanes. The decision was made to fly in the Spitfire, the Royal Air Force's most advanced interceptor. The challenge was immense. The aircraft lacked the range to reach the island from Gibraltar, and sea convoys were too vulnerable. The only solution was to launch them from aircraft carriers within reach of Malta's shores. Operations were prepared in secret, involving both British and American carriers. The first attempt would come in early March. For the men still fighting on the island, those plans were distant rumours. Each sunrise meant another day of endurance. Mechanics scavenged bomb fragments to repair shattered hangars. Pilots wrote farewell notes tucked into flight jackets, fully aware that few survived more than a dozen sorties. The Luftwaffe maintained pressure without mercy. On the 20th of March, 400 tons of explosives were dropped within 24 hours, a bombardment that rivaled anything Europe had witnessed. Whole sections of Valletta were reduced to ruins. The Cathedral of St. John, centuries old, lost its roof. Yet beneath this inferno, Malta's will endured. The Maltese civilians, described by visiting correspondents as indestructible, carried on through dust and hunger. Whenever a British fighter roared overhead, even a solitary aircraft, they cheered. That defiance became the heartbeat of the island, a signal that as long as even one plane could rise, Malta still fought. As April dawned, Kesselring's intelligence officers reported the RAF reduced to barely a dozen operational aircraft. The field commanders in Sicily grew convinced that final victory was within reach. Preparations were even made for an amphibious assault should the island fall silent. Axis pilots spoke openly of celebrating in Valletta within weeks. Few of them realized that across the sea, on the decks of two carriers, HMS Eagle and USS Wasp, dozens of Spitfires were being readied for launch. The Luftwaffe's domination of the Maltese skies appeared absolute, yet this very certainty blinded them to what was coming. Beneath the ruins of the airfields, engineers prepared new dispersal bays, and radar operators fine-tuned their sets to catch any hint of an approaching raid. Every pilot still alive trained his eyes northward, wondering when the reinforcements would arrive. The stage was set for a reversal that no one in Kesselring's headquarters could have imagined. The next phase of the siege would see the arrival of aircraft that could outfight the vaunted Messerschmitts and restore hope to the island fortress. The Luftwaffe had struck with unmatched fury, but Malta was still breathing, and its defenders were waiting to strike back. By April 1942, Malta was an island barely clinging to life. From the air it resembled a landscape carved by war itself, its once lush hills now stripped bare, its harbours reduced to a graveyard of twisted cranes and half-sunken ships. The Luftwaffe's unrelenting assault had ground down every element of defence. Every morning the horizon glowed with the flash of bombs, and every evening the horizon glowed again, this time with the fires they left behind. The days had begun to merge into one another. Air raid sirens no longer startled the people below. They had become as common as the tolling of a church bell. Valletta's streets were empty, save for rubble and the echo of distant explosions. The Maltese people, once farmers and shopkeepers, now lived underground, in tunnels cut deep into the limestone, some stretching for miles beneath the ruined city. There were no seasons anymore, only the endless hum of engines overhead and the tremor of detonations shaking the earth. By now, the Luftwaffe believed the job was almost finished. Kesselring's pilots reported that Malta's defences were destroyed, its airfields inoperable. Radio intercepts from Sicily bragged of total air supremacy. Axis bomber crews spoke of the island as if it were already conquered. In their minds, Malta was no longer a fortress, but a tomb waiting to be sealed. On the ground, the defenders knew the truth was even worse than the Germans imagined. Of the hundreds of aircraft that had once passed through Malta since 1940, fewer than 30 were still operational. Those that remained were barely airworthy, patched together from scavenged parts, their wings stitched with repair panels, their engines coughing black smoke on takeoff. Mechanics worked without sleep, hands bleeding and ears ringing, scavenging broken propellers to rebuild another machine. The island's fuel reserves were nearly exhausted, forcing commanders to ration flights to a handful per day. The Hurricanes that had fought so valiantly were now utterly obsolete. Each dogfight ended in disaster. Pilots scrambled from the runway, knowing that once they met the Bf-19s, survival depended on luck. One of the veterans later recalled, every sortie felt like being sent to face death with a pistol against a cannon. The few Spitfires that had reached Malta earlier that spring offered a brief flicker of hope. Their sleek fuselages and superior speed made them a match for the German fighters, yet their arrival had been ill-fated. Many were destroyed on the ground within hours of landing, caught in Luftwaffe bombing runs that seemed to target the very moment of their arrival. Those that did take to the air soon succumbed to mechanical failure or were picked off by seasoned Axis pilots. In April alone, over 12,000 sorties thundered down upon Malta. The skies never emptied. Bombs fell with mathematical precision, cutting runways into ribbons and obliterating every structure above ground. Valletta's harbour was struck so often that smoke rose from its ruins day and night, a black column that could be seen from Sicily 50 miles away. Inside the shelters, the Maltese civilians lived in suffocating darkness. Families huddled beneath flickering oil lamps as the ground shook around them. Mothers whispered prayers to drown out the sound of crumbling stone. Children clutched small icons of saints while the air filled with dust. The priests who moved among them could only offer words of courage, their sermons muffled by the thud of another blast. The civilians' endurance became a weapon of its own, a defiance that refused to yield even when everything else seemed lost. Across the airfields of Tarkali and Lucca, the scene was one of exhaustion bordering on despair. Pilots slept in their cockpits, knowing that if a raid came, there would be no time to reach the shelters. Fuel bowsers sat empty, rationed for only the most urgent interceptions. When an alarm was raised, ground crews pushed planes by hand to clear rubble from the runways. The smell of burnt aviation fuel clung to every breath. Reports sent to London grew grimmer each day. Malta's governor, Lieutenant General William Dobbie, described the situation as approaching collapse. Reinforcements were begged for: men, ammunition, fuel, and above all, Spitfires. Without them, he warned, the island could hold out no longer. The Admiralty, however, faced impossible choices. Convoys bound for Malta suffered catastrophic losses. Submarines prowled the approaches, and Axis aircraft destroyed supply ships within sight of the island. By mid-April, the situation had reached breaking point. The Luftwaffe's dominance was absolute. There were moments when no British aircraft could take off at all. For 2 days straight, not a single plane left the ground. The island's defenders could only watch helplessly as Axis bombers came and went without challenge. The enemy, believing victory certain, grew reckless in their confidence. Pilots flew lower, strafing the ruins of Valletta for sport. They broadcast mock radio messages claiming that resistance had ended. It was during this time that the resolve of the Maltese people earned them eternal recognition. Despite hunger, fear, and the constant roar of death above their heads, they refused to surrender. King George VI, moved by their courage, awarded the entire island the George Cross, the highest honour for civilian bravery in the British Empire. When the message reached Malta, it was read aloud in shelters lit by lanterns to people who had lost everything. The words brought tears, not because they promised survival, but because they acknowledged the island's endurance. That same week, the RAF made one final stand. 18 surviving fighters, some so damaged they could barely take off, were scrambled to intercept a raid of nearly 70 bombers. The British pilots climbed through flak and smoke, meeting the attackers head-on. The sky turned into a storm of tracers. 2 Hurricanes exploded mid-air, and another crash-landed in flames beside the runway. Yet the remaining pilots pressed on, diving through the bomber formations to scatter them before they could release their payloads. For a brief hour, Malta's sky belonged to its defenders again. When the last aircraft limped home, the ground crews cheered through tears. Still, the island was dying. Food rations had been cut to near starvation levels. Civilians boiled weeds and chewed stale bread baked from powdered grain. Disease spread through the shelters. Medical supplies were gone, and hospitals had no power to sterilize equipment. Even the military was near collapse. Ammunition stocks were critically low, and fuel reserves could barely sustain another week of operations. The Luftwaffe, sensing the end, launched what it called the final phase. On the morning of 21st April 1942, hundreds of aircraft crossed the sea once more. The attack began before sunrise and continued into the night. The bombers came in waves, striking every hour until the island was covered in dust and smoke. Entire villages vanished beneath the bombardment. Grand Harbour burned so fiercely that ships sank still, tethered to their moorings. The airfields were craters of ash. When the last siren fell silent that evening, the defenders took stock. Of all aircraft on the island, only 17 were left in flying condition. For the first time in 2 years of war, Malta's Air Command faced the possibility of total extinction. If no reinforcements arrived, the island would be lost. The Luftwaffe's pilots celebrated in Sicily, convinced their mission was complete. Champagne corks were popped and communiques were sent to Berlin proclaiming the destruction of Malta's air defences. They were premature. What the Germans could not see from their observation posts was that beneath the ash and wreckage, the defenders were still working. In underground workshops, mechanics repaired engines salvaged from wrecked planes. Pilots plotted new dispersal patterns to minimize losses. Signals officers coordinated with British intelligence for word of aid. Across the island, the question was whispered again and again, when will the Spitfires come? That answer was already in motion. In the Atlantic, a joint operation between the Royal Navy and the United States Navy was underway. Two carriers, HMS Eagle and USS Wasp, had been loaded with dozens of Spitfire MAC-Vs. Their mission: deliver the fighters to Malta or perish in the attempt. Every man aboard those ships knew that the island's survival depended on their success. As the Luftwaffe celebrated its supposed triumph, a new force was about to arrive, one that would change the course of the Mediterranean War. The Spitfire, sleek and deadly, was coming to reclaim the skies. Malta's moment of collapse would soon become its resurrection. The island had reached the very edge of defeat, yet history was preparing to turn in its favor. The dawn of May 9th, 1942, was only days away, the day the hunters would become the hunted. The Mediterranean shimmered like glass beneath a rising sun on the 9th of May, 1942. Far to the west of Malta, two aircraft carriers, one British, one American, cut their way through calm waters. On the decks stood rows of Supermarine Spitfire Mark Vs, their polished wings catching the early light. Pilots in leather jackets and silk scarves moved among the aircraft, checking instruments, adjusting gun sights, and sharing brief handshakes that said everything words could not. They all knew what was at stake. Below decks, sailors whispered the same phrase again and again: for Malta. The operation was called Bowery. It had been planned in utmost secrecy, designed to break the island's death spiral. Previous efforts to send Spitfires had ended in disaster, some shot down en route, others destroyed on the ground within hours of arrival. Those failures had taught harsh lessons. This time, the plan left no room for mistakes. 64 fighters would launch from the decks of HMS Eagle and USS Wasp in coordinated waves, refuel briefly in Malta, and be ready for combat almost immediately. Every step was calculated down to the minute. On the bridge of Wasp, Captain Forrest Sherman studied the charts while Royal Navy officers conferred quietly at his side. The air was tense, but beneath the tension there was pride. It was rare to see two navies from opposite sides of the Atlantic working in such harmony. Above them, the smell of fuel and salt mingled as deck crews prepared the Spitfires for launch. Each aircraft bore the distinctive blue and red roundel of the RAF, though many carried hastily painted American carrier markings for the voyage. At dawn, the order was given. Engines roared to life, and one by one, the Spitfires surged down the flight deck, wheels leaving steel for open air. For many of the pilots, it was their first time taking off from a carrier, a maneuver fraught with risk. The sea stretched endlessly below, and the slightest misjudgment could send a plane cartwheeling into the waves. Yet every pilot launched cleanly, climbing into formation as the carriers disappeared astern. 64 aircraft, sleek and silver, streaked east toward the besieged island. In Malta, word of their approach reached the control tower at Tarkali just after 10 a.m. The operators, hollow-eyed from weeks of sleepless nights, exchanged glances they scarcely dared to hope for. Moments later, the distant hum of engines echoed through the sky. To those on the ground, it was a sound like deliverance. As the first Spitfires appeared through the haze, mechanics and civilians alike rushed to the airfield. Some cheered, others simply stood in silence, watching those shining wings descend through the smoke-stained clouds. Landing on the bomb-cratered runways was treacherous. Dust clouds obscured visibility, and wreckage from previous raids still littered the field. Yet the pilots brought their aircraft down with precision, each guided by the knowledge that seconds counted. Ground crews swarmed forward the instant the wheels touched down. Fuel trucks already waiting topped off tanks, armourers loaded ammunition, mechanics inspected for damage. Some planes were airborne again within 10 minutes of arrival. It was a display of coordination born from desperation. By midday, all 64 Spitfires had reached Malta safely. For the first time in months, the RAF possessed a fighting force capable of challenging the Luftwaffe head-on. The atmosphere on the island transformed. Pilots who had spent weeks outmatched in aging hurricanes now found themselves with machines that could turn tighter, climb faster, and strike harder than anything the enemy could throw at them. The defenders felt the balance of the war begin to shift beneath their feet. Wing Commander Keith Park, who had once commanded Fighter Command during the Battle of Britain, now led Malta's defence. His presence alone brought a sense of authority and calm. Standing on the control tower balcony, he watched the new arrivals roar overhead and remarked quietly, "Now we have the tools to finish this." The Luftwaffe, unaware of what had just unfolded, launched yet another afternoon raid. Bombers approached from the north in perfect formation, escorted by squadrons of Bf-109s. It was a sight the islanders had seen countless times before, but this time something was different. When the sirens wailed and the radar screens flared to life, it was Spitfires that rose from the runways. The interceptors climbed in tight spirals, their Merlin engines screaming as they raced to meet the incoming formation. At 20,000 feet, the two forces collided. The Germans expected an easy slaughter, the kind they had enjoyed for months. Instead, they met opponents who could fight on equal terms. Spitfires cut through their ranks, guns blazing, turning the clear sky into chaos. Bombers veered wildly, breaking formation under the sudden assault. One German pilot later recalled his shock. "We were used to hurricanes. They came at us slow and heavy. These new ones, they came from nowhere." The air above Malta became a theatre of duels, machine guns spitting fire, sunlight flashing off wings as the fighters twisted and rolled. From the ground, civilians peered from the ruins and cheered as black crosses tumbled in flames toward the sea. By the time the raid ended, the balance had changed. More than a dozen Axis aircraft had been shot down or forced to ditch in the Mediterranean. The defenders lost only a handful. The news spread through the shelters like wildfire. The Spitfires had come, and they had won their first battle. That evening, for the first time in months, the Maltese watched the sunset without the sound of bombs. Yet victory was fragile. The Luftwaffe was still powerful, and the island remained scarred. Over the following days, Park and his men worked tirelessly to maintain the new momentum. The Spitfires were dispersed across multiple airfields to avoid another disaster like those earlier in April. Hidden revetments were built from rubble and sandbags, each one just large enough to conceal a single aircraft. Mechanics slept beside their planes, ready to repair them the instant the engines cooled. Every resource was stretched to its limit, but now there was a renewed sense of purpose. Among the new arrivals were some of the RAF's most skilled pilots, veterans drawn from squadrons across the Empire. Many had seen service over France and the Channel, others had come from North Africa. They adapted quickly to the harsh conditions of Malta's rocky terrain. Days were blisteringly hot, nights were cold, and supplies were meagre. Yet none complained. Each morning the fighters lined up and thundered skyward to meet the next wave from Sicily. For the Germans, the sudden resurgence of resistance was bewildering. Intelligence officers struggled to understand how the RAF had replaced its losses so quickly. Reports from returning bomber crews described dozens of new Spitfires and increased accuracy from anti-aircraft batteries. Kesselring dismissed these claims at first, assuming the British were bluffing. Within days, he realized the truth. The island he believed was dying had come back to life. As the Spitfires gained control of the sky, the effect rippled across every aspect of the siege. Axis bombers found it increasingly difficult to hit their targets. Supply convoys to Rommel's army in North Africa began to suffer renewed losses as Malta's aircraft once again harassed them from above. The island that had seemed doomed now stood as a beacon of resistance in the heart of the Mediterranean. Still, the battle was far from over. The Luftwaffe regrouped, vowing to erase the humiliation of their losses. They prepared for a massive counterstrike, a raid so large that it would dwarf anything Malta had seen before. The pilots of the RAF could sense it coming. Each morning, reconnaissance reports showed increased activity on Sicilian airfields. The Germans were preparing for something catastrophic. In the shelters, civilians resumed their prayers. They knew the storm would return, though this time they had reason to believe the outcome could be different. Above the island, the Spitfires continued their patrols, silver silhouettes against the blue sky, ready to meet whatever came their way. That evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Wing Commander Park stood beside his men, watching the streaks of vapor trails fade into dusk. "Tomorrow," he said, "they will come again." He was right. The next dawn would bring the fiercest air battle Malta had ever known, a day when the island's fate would hang in the balance once more, and the Spitfire would prove its legend. The morning of the 10th of May, 1942 began with an uneasy calm. The sky over Malta was a pale blue, streaked with the faint contrails of distant patrols. Beneath that fragile stillness, every man on the island sensed what was coming. The Luftwaffe had gone quiet for several days, too quiet. Radar operators at Lascaris headquarters watched their screens with growing tension, the silence broken only by the hum of machinery and the scratch of pencils noting bearing lines. To the north, on the edge of the radar's reach, a dense cluster of echoes began to bloom. The enemy was returning, and this time in strength greater than ever before. Inside the underground operations room, Air Vice Marshal Keith Park studied the reports. Dozens of bombers, possibly more, approaching from Sicily with heavy escort. Park, a man of calm authority, gave no grand speech. He simply turned to his controller and said, "Scramble every Spitfire we have." Engines roared across the shattered airfields of Tarkali, Halfar and Lucca. Mechanics waved the pilots out with oil-stained hands, shielding their faces from the hurricane of dust. The newly arrived Spitfires taxied through craters and debris, lifting off one after another. Within minutes, more than 50 aircraft were airborne, forming into squadrons that climbed steadily into the glare of the rising sun. At 20,000 feet, the formations began to fan out. The pilots watched the horizon, where a dark line was spreading rapidly. Moments later, it resolved into the unmistakable shapes of Stuka dive bombers and Junkers Ju-88s, escorted by sleek Messerschmitt Bf-109s flying high cover. The Luftwaffe had come in full force, hundreds of aircraft strong, determined to deliver the killing blow. Below them, the island braced for impact. Anti-aircraft guns along the Grand Harbour prepared their shells, their crews grimly focused. Civilians crowded into shelters, listening to the distant rumble growing louder. For weeks, Malta had endured these raids helplessly. Now, for the first time in months, it had the power to strike back. The Spitfires attacked before the bombers could form up over the target. Diving out of the sun, they tore into the German formation with lethal precision. Caught off guard, the escorts scrambled to react, twisting through the air to defend their charges. The sky erupted into chaos, a swirling storm of silver and black tracer fire cutting across the morning light. Flight Lieutenant Johnny Plagueis of No. 249 Squadron spotted a Ju-88 below him and rolled his Spitfire into a steep dive. His guns flashed and the bomber's left engine exploded into flame. The aircraft spiraled downwards, smoke trailing across the sky. Moments later, Plagueis was forced to break away as cannon shells ripped past his wing from a pursuing Messerschmitt. He pulled into a tight turn, forcing his enemy to overshoot and squeezed the trigger again. The Bf-109 burst apart in mid-air. "That was for the island," he muttered to himself, climbing back into the melee. Across the battlefront, similar duels played out in every direction. The Ju-87 Stukas, once the terror of Europe, found themselves hunted like prey. Their precision dives were disrupted as Spitfires slashed through their formations, sending them tumbling into the sea. The defenders' training and experience, honed in the desperate weeks before, now paid dividends. The RAF pilots flew as a single organism, covering each other, anticipating movements, striking and withdrawing with fluid coordination. From the ground, the spectacle was breathtaking. Maltese civilians emerging from the shelters stared upward at the dogfights above their ruined cities. Witnesses described the sky as a living tapestry, white vapor trails twisting like threads, aircraft looping and diving, explosions blooming like sudden stars. Corporal Cyril Wood of the Royal Artillery later said, "I looked up and saw Stukas dropping, Spitfires circling them like hawks, and the sea dotted with German dinghies. It was as if the island itself had risen to fight. The Axis assault, so meticulously planned, began to unravel. Each bombing wave that reached Malta was smaller than the one before. Flak and Spitfires shredded the formations before they could even line up on their targets. Anti-aircraft batteries joined the fray, turning the air over Grand Harbour into a wall of steel. The Germans pressed on, determined to hit the docks and airfields, but the defenders now had complete control of altitude and timing. As the hours passed, the balance tipped decisively. By noon, the RAF's ground controllers were fielding radio calls from pilots out of ammunition, yet unwilling to disengage. Some switched to ramming tactics, forcing enemy bombers off course with daring close passes. Others descended to sea level, hunting crippled aircraft, trying to limp back towards Sicily. On one such pursuit, Canadian ace George Buzz Burling downed 2 Ju-88s and a Bf-109 within minutes, his accuracy so precise that observers swore his bullets traced the shape of his target's insignia. His reputation as a marksman was growing with every sortie. To his fellow airmen, he was both admired and feared, reckless in courage, unstoppable in combat. By mid-afternoon, the Luftwaffe was in disarray. Smoke columns rose from the sea where bombers had plunged into the water. Dozens of parachutes drifted down like white petals, marking the end of enemy aircraft. The Maltese Coast Guard began rescuing survivors, Germans and Italians alike, from their dinghies. Some of the captured airmen stared in disbelief at the devastation they had witnessed, muttering that Malta must have received an entire air fleet overnight. When the final formations turned back towards Sicily, the Spitfires pursued them halfway across the channel before breaking off. The island fell silent once more, except for the distant thunder of explosions fading into the horizon. The battle had lasted nearly 6 hours. The aftermath revealed the scale of the victory. More than 60 Axis aircraft were confirmed destroyed, with dozens more damaged beyond repair. RAF losses were astonishingly low, only a few fighters shot down, most of their pilots rescued. The Luftwaffe's greatest offensive against Malta had been turned into a rout. That evening, the island erupted in celebration. From the rubble of Valletta, people emerged to cheer as the returning Spitfires passed overhead. Mechanics lined the runways, waving as the aircraft touched down one by one. Civilians brought what little wine remained and shared it among the pilots. For the first time in months, laughter echoed across the airfields. Someone painted a message in chalk on the wall of a bombed-out hangar. 10 May, the day Malta fought back. In his official report, Keith Park called it a magnificent victory born of discipline and endurance. To the Maltese, it became known forever as the glorious 10th of May. Newspapers in London and Cairo soon carried the story, declaring that the island fortress had struck a decisive blow against Axis air power. Across the empire, the name Malta became synonymous with courage and defiance. That night, the sky was strangely quiet. The Luftwaffe had ceased its raids for the first time in months. Fires still smouldered in the ruins, but above them, the stars shone clear. Pilots sat together in the dim light of their mess hall, exhausted but triumphant. For many, it was the first meal eaten without interruption by air raid sirens. The victory was more than symbolic. The German command in Sicily had suffered a blow to morale that no amount of propaganda could disguise. Their pilots, once masters of the Mediterranean, now faced an opponent capable of outmatching them in both skill and machinery. Kesselring's confidence faltered as reports flooded in. Entire squadrons decimated, bomber crews refusing to fly until replacements arrived, and aircraft shortages that could not be replenished quickly enough. Malta had endured unimaginable hardship to reach this moment, and the reward was more than survival. It was dominance. The island that had been written off as a lost cause now held the initiative. The hunters had become the hunted. For those who fought that day, the memory never faded. Many would recall the sunlight glinting off wings, the smell of cordite and oil, the feeling of release after months of fear. It was the day the Spitfires of Malta turned despair into victory, a day when the impossible had been achieved through courage and will. The Luftwaffe would return, of course, desperate to reclaim its pride. Yet the tide of the air war had shifted decisively. The men of Malta had proven that even the smallest outpost, when armed with resolve and the right machines, could defy an empire. As dawn approached once more, the island slept under a quiet sky. The people knew peace would be brief, but they also knew something deeper, that Malta was no longer fighting to survive. It was fighting to win. The fires from the glorious 10th still glowed faintly across the Grand Harbour when new orders arrived at Field Marshal Albert Kesselring's headquarters in Sicily. He had promised Berlin that Malta would soon be erased from the map, that its airfields would be craters and its harbours useless. Yet the reports coming in from his own squadrons told another story. Fighter groups had been mauled, bomber units were down to half strength, and morale had collapsed. Pilots who once joked of hunting island rats now spoke in subdued tones, haunted by the sight of flaming aircraft spiralling into the Mediterranean. Kesselring read through the damage assessments in silence. 60 aircraft lost in a single day. Dozens of others too damaged to fly. He pressed his hands together and stared across the map of the central Mediterranean, realizing the Luftwaffe's dominance had cracked. The RAF had reclaimed the air over Malta, and the cost of continuing the offensive was climbing beyond reason. Still, in his message to Hitler, Kesselring chose his words carefully. "Enemy air and naval bases at Malta eliminated," he wrote, a statement that would soon be remembered for its spectacular inaccuracy. On the island, the effects of that miscalculation were immediate. As Kesselring's report reached Berlin, the Luftwaffe began withdrawing entire units from Sicilian airfields. Fighter groups were ordered to redeploy east to the Russian front, while bombers were redirected to aid Rommel in North Africa. Within days, reconnaissance aircraft over Malta reported empty hangars where once hundreds of German planes had stood wing to wing. The once constant roar from the north faded into silence. For the defenders, that silence felt unreal. After months of ceaseless bombing, there was suddenly space to breathe. The island's airfields, once pitted with craters, hummed with activity as engineers rushed to restore full operations. Pilots who had slept in their cockpits now rested under open skies, while ground crews cleaned the soot from their hands and began counting the enemy wreckage scattered across the sea. Valletta, though scarred beyond recognition, still stood, its people stepping cautiously into sunlight without the shriek of incoming bombs. In the days that followed, the RAF seized the initiative. Squadrons that had fought purely in defence now took the fight across the water. Reconnaissance missions probed deep into Axis airspace, capturing photographs of empty airstrips and ships lined in Sicilian harbours. It was clear the enemy had begun to retreat. Keith Parks saw the opportunity immediately. Standing before a group of weary pilots in the operations room at Lucca, he outlined a new doctrine. The age of passive defence was over. Malta would now strike first. Every sortie launched from the island carried that new confidence. Spitfires patrolled beyond the coastline, engaging enemy reconnaissance planes before they could even sight the island. On the 15th of May, 3 German Ju-88s were intercepted, returning from a failed raid on the harbour. All 3 were destroyed in quick succession, their crews fished from the sea by Allied patrol boats. The psychological effect rippled through the Luftwaffe. Pilots who had once viewed Malta as an easy target now called it the Hornet's Nest. The change in fortunes could be felt everywhere. In the mess halls, laughter returned. Mechanics painted kill tallies on the fuselages of Spitfires. The Maltese people, emerging from underground shelters, began repairing their shattered homes. Children played again in the streets, using spent shell casings as toys. For the first time in 2 years, church bells rang without being drowned out by sirens. Among the pilots who came to symbolise this resurgence was George Buzz Burling, the young Canadian from 249 Squadron. Quiet and solitary, he spent more time in the air than on the ground. His precision shooting was legendary. He could bring down an aircraft with a short burst where others wasted entire magazines. In the weeks after the May battles, Burling's score climbed rapidly. Messerschmitts, Mackeys and bombers all falling to his guns. His comrades called him the Knight of Malta, a title he neither sought nor denied. On 27th July 1942, Burling found himself locked in combat with one of the Axis's finest, Italian ace captain Furio Nicolot Doglio. The two met in the skies north of the island, their squadrons swirling around them like dueling flocks. Doglio, famous across the Regia Aeronautica as the Spitfire killer, had claimed several victories over Malta and flew with fearless precision. That morning, he led his flight toward Lucca, confident he would add to his tally. Burling spotted him from above, sunlight flashing across the Italian's canopy. He dove from altitude, throttling forward until the engine screamed. Doglio never saw the Spitfire coming. Burling's first burst struck the Mackey's fuel tank. The second split the fuselage clean in two. The wreckage fell burning into the sea. Doglio's death reverberated through Axis ranks. To his comrades, he had seemed invincible. Now the symbol of their prowess was gone, shot down in full daylight. Italian morale plummeted, and the surviving pilots began to view Malta as a cursed battlefield. One later recalled, "When Doglio fell, it was as if the heart of our spirit died with him." The momentum continued to shift. Each passing week saw fewer raids, fewer enemy formations daring to cross the narrow sea. The Luftwaffe, drained of resources and confidence, began focusing on other theatres. For Malta, this breathing space meant survival and revenge. The Spitfire squadrons patrolled aggressively, intercepting Axis transport planes bound for North Africa and escorting British bombers on strikes against Sicilian ports. The hunters who had once ruled the sky were now prey. The Allied command took full advantage of this transformation. Supplies began to reach Malta with greater frequency. Convoys, though still under attack, faced less concentrated opposition. Merchant ships carrying fuel and ammunition arrived to cheering crowds. The island's anti-aircraft gunners fired their last shells of celebration into the air, signalling to every ship that Malta lived. From Kesselring's perspective, the situation had spiraled beyond control. His forces were stretched thin, and his superiors demanded results he could no longer deliver. Reports from his field officers painted a grim picture: exhausted crews, mechanical failures, declining morale. The Luftwaffe had reached the limits of its reach. Hitler, unaware of the true scale of the disaster, redirected his attention to the Eastern Front, leaving the Mediterranean to stagnate. The RAF's new superiority reshaped the war in subtle but profound ways. With the skies secure, Malta became a launchpad for attacks on Axis convoys supplying Rommel. Submarines and aircraft based on the island struck relentlessly at ships crossing from Italy to North Africa. The once steady stream of fuel and ammunition feeding the Africa Corps began to dwindle. Every sinking echoed across the desert battlefields where German tanks stood idle for want of fuel. Within weeks, the island that had been on the edge of annihilation had turned into the Axis' greatest threat. The transformation was astonishing. Allied intelligence noted a sharp drop in Axis convoy success rates. In April, 4 out of 5 shipments reached their destination. By July, barely 1 in 3 made it through. Malta had become the blade cutting the enemy's supply line in half. For the men who had lived through the siege, the change felt almost unreal. Pilots returning from sorties now flew over clear water, no longer littered with wreckage. The docks at Valletta began to bustle again, ships offloading crates of food and munitions. Children climbed onto rooftops to wave at the Spitfires flying overhead, their cheers echoing between bombed-out buildings. The sound of engines had become music rather than menace. Even so, everyone knew the war was far from over. The Axis command still possessed formidable resources, and Kesselring had not given up entirely. Plans were forming for one final offensive to crush Malta once and for all. The island's defenders, aware of this, worked day and night to prepare. Runways were reinforced, aircraft dispersed, and ammunition stockpiled. Park understood that the next confrontation would determine whether Malta's newfound strength could truly endure. By late summer, reconnaissance photos confirmed renewed enemy buildup across Sicilian airfields. Hundreds of aircraft were gathering once more. The lull was ending. Kesselring had assembled what remained of his air arm for a final all-or-nothing assault. On the eve of battle, as darkness fell over the island, pilots gathered around their aircraft, talking in hushed tones. Cigarettes glowed faintly in the night as mechanics performed last-minute checks. Above them, the sky was clear, the stars sharp and cold. Every man knew that come morning, those stars would vanish in fire and smoke once again. The siege had entered its final act. The Luftwaffe was preparing for a desperate bid to reclaim its lost dominance, and Malta's Spitfires stood ready to meet it head-on. The next confrontation would decide the fate of the island, and perhaps the outcome of the entire Mediterranean War. The summer of 1942 settled over Malta like a furnace. The limestone cliffs shimmered under the relentless sun, and the air hung heavy with dust and fuel fumes. Yet amid the heat, there was a new kind of tension, an anticipation that stretched across every airfield and harbour. Intelligence reports had confirmed Kesselring's intentions. The Axis was assembling one final armada of bombers and fighters in Sicily, a concentrated force that would determine the island's fate once and for all. For the men who had fought through the spring, this was the moment everything had been leading toward. The Spitfire squadrons had grown strong, rebuilt through shipments of aircraft ferried by convoy and carrier. Ammunition stores had been replenished, engines refitted, and pilots hardened by constant battle. Where months earlier the defenders had counted aircraft in single digits, now they could launch entire wings into the sky. Still, no one underestimated the enemy. The Luftwaffe's power, though waning, remained formidable, and this final offensive promised to eclipse everything that had come before. At dawn on the 14th of July 1942, the radar screens at Lascaris flickered alive with dense patches of blips spreading across the northern approach. The pattern was unmistakable, hundreds of aircraft advancing in waves. The operators called out bearings in clipped tones as phones rang across the network of underground command rooms. Within minutes, Park's calm voice came over the intercom. "Scramble all squadrons. Full readiness." Engines coughed into life along the airstrips at Halfar, Lucca and Tarkali. Pilots clambered into cockpits, sweat already beading on their faces in the stifling morning heat. Mechanics pulled away wheel chocks as propellers blurred into motion. Over the radio, ground control's orders cut through the static. Vector 085, altitude 20,000 intercept. The Spitfires rose into a clear blue sky, the sun flashing along their wings as they climbed toward the oncoming swarm. From the north, the enemy came, Junkers Ju-80s in tight formation, escorted by squadrons of Messerschmitt Bf-109s and Italian Macchi fighters. The sight of so many aircraft stretching across the horizon was breathtaking. Sunlight glinted off bomb bays and canopies as the formation spread wide to envelop the island. The noise reached Malta's shores a moment later, a rolling thunder that shook windows and sent civilians racing for the shelters they had come to know so well. The first contact came high above the coastline. A formation of Spitfires led by squadron leader Terence Brennan swept down from the sun and tore into the escorts. Cannon fire traced white lines through the sky as the formation shattered. Dogfights erupted instantly, the calm morning air replaced by a chaotic ballet of speed and fire. Below, the bombers pressed on toward their targets, only to find themselves harried from every angle. From his command post, Park monitored the battle through reports relayed from radar and observation posts. His strategy was simple and ruthless. Keep the Spitfires rotating through the fight, never giving the bombers a moment's stability. As one wave disengaged to refuel, another took its place. The air war over Malta had evolved into a masterpiece of coordination, refined through months of hardship and ingenuity. By midday, the Luftwaffe's plan had begun to unravel. The dense formations that had left Sicily in perfect order now dissolved into scattered fragments. Many of the bombers failed to reach their targets, forced to jettison their payloads into the sea or turn back entirely. The Bf-109 escorts found themselves outnumbered, their fuel running low after prolonged dogfights over hostile territory. Each minute of combat pushed them closer to the limits of endurance. At one point, a single Spitfire squadron intercepted a group of Italian bombers attempting a low-level run on Grand Harbour. The attackers had hoped to slip beneath radar coverage, but Maltese spotters atop the cliffs near Medina raised the alarm in time. The defenders climbed steeply, meeting the enemy head-on at less than 2,000 feet. In that brief, furious exchange, 6 bombers were destroyed. The survivors limped away, trailing smoke, chased by bursts of anti-aircraft fire from the gun emplacements below. For the Maltese watching from their shelters, the spectacle above was both terrifying and awe-inspiring. The sky seemed alive, filled with twisting shapes, flashes of fire, and the echo of engines roaring through clouds of black flak. Some onlookers described it as a storm made of metal and thunder. Each time a German bomber fell in flames, cheers erupted even through the muffled walls of the underground tunnels. By late afternoon, the air battle began to fade. The last formations turned north, their mission a failure. Behind them, the sea was littered with debris, burning fuel slicks, parachutes drifting on the wind, and the wreckage of aircraft that had fallen short of Sicily. The Spitfires, low on fuel and ammunition, regrouped over the island and returned to their airfields. Many were so riddled with holes that mechanics marveled they had made it home at all, yet the victory was undeniable. The next day brought another attempt, then another after that. Each time, the results grew more disastrous for the Axis. The RAF's numerical advantage, coupled with the skill of its pilots, made every new raid a costly gamble. Within a week, more than 50 German and Italian aircraft had been destroyed or heavily damaged. On 24th of July, Kesselring called off the offensive entirely. The siege that had begun 2 years earlier had broken. For the men on Malta, the realization came slowly. The air raid sirens, once the island's constant soundtrack, began to fall silent. Days passed without a single alarm. The civilians emerged cautiously, unsure if it was truly over. When no bombers appeared, the streets filled once more with people. Children laughed again, and church bells rang freely across Valletta's shattered skyline. In the aftermath of the failed offensive, attention turned to survival in a different sense. Malta's population was starving. Years of siege had left food stocks perilously low, and fuel reserves were nearly gone. The victory in the air had ensured the island's safety, but its people still faced the slow death of hunger and isolation. To alleviate this, the British prepared a new convoy, Operation Pedestal. The plan was audacious. 14 merchant ships, heavily guarded by a fleet of cruisers and aircraft carriers, would sail from Gibraltar to Malta, braving the gauntlet of Axis airfields, submarines, and surface ships. The convoy's success would mean the difference between endurance and surrender. Every man in the Mediterranean theatre understood the stakes. On the 11th of August, the first reports reached Malta of the convoy's progress. From observation posts, sailors scanned the western horizon with binoculars, searching for the faintest sign of masts or smoke. For days, the island listened to distant radio chatter as ships fought their way through an inferno of torpedoes and bombs. The convoy suffered appalling losses, vessels burning, men lost at sea, but some pressed on, driven by sheer determination. Then, on the 15th of August, the Feast of Santa Maria, the miracle happened. Just after dawn, lookouts spotted a dark silhouette on the horizon. The oil tanker Ohio, listing badly, its decks aflame, towed between two British destroyers. Behind her came the battered remnants of the convoy. As the ships limped into Grand Harbour, the island erupted in cheers. Church bells rang across every village. Civilians lined the shore, waving flags and handkerchiefs. Many wept openly, their joy mixed with disbelief. The Ohio carried precious fuel and supplies, enough to keep Malta alive and its fighters flying. That moment marked the symbolic end of the siege. The Luftwaffe no longer held the skies, and the Axis blockade had been pierced. Malta had endured everything the enemy could muster and still stood unbroken. The pilots, sailors and civilians who had weathered 2 years of unrelenting assault understood what their survival meant. The island was no longer just a fortress. It had become a symbol of Allied resistance, an anvil on which Axis ambitions had shattered. As the sun set that evening, the people of Malta gathered in the streets, singing hymns of thanksgiving. The war raged elsewhere, but for one night the island knew peace. The Spitfires lined along the airfields stood silent, their wings gleaming in the fading light, ready for whatever lay ahead. The victory over the siege had transformed Malta from a beleaguered outpost into a weapon poised for retribution. Soon, those same aircraft would launch raids deep into enemy territory, striking at the convoys that fed Rommel's armies. The hunter's role had changed forever. The storm had passed, but the fight for dominance in the Mediterranean was entering its final phase, and Malta now held the upper hand. The siege that had tested Malta beyond human endurance was over, yet the echoes of its struggle reverberated far beyond the Mediterranean. The island that once seemed destined for obliteration had emerged as a symbol of resistance and triumph, a fortress reborn from its own ruins. The summer of 1942 marked a turning point in the war's tempo across the region, and the pilots who had fought above its skies now carried with them a legacy that would ripple through the entire Allied campaign. In the weeks following the arrival of the Ohio convoy, Malta transformed. Where silence had once followed the last Luftwaffe raid, now the air buzzed with movement and purpose. Repair crews swarmed over the airfields, filling craters, rebuilding hangars, and painting fresh markings on the Spitfires that had become the island's guardians. The harbours that had been graveyards for so long now bustled again with the energy of renewal. New ships arrived carrying food, ammunition, and spare parts, each crate and barrel a promise that the island's suffering had not been in vain. Pilots who had spent the better part of a year living on the edge of death suddenly found themselves operating from a position of strength. Missions once flown in desperation were now undertaken with confidence. The RAF's Spitfire squadrons patrolled far beyond the Maltese coastline, intercepting Axis aircraft before they could even reach their intended targets. The hunter's instinct, sharpened by months of survival, had been unleashed. One of the first to lead these new offensive operations was Wing Commander Keith Park. His reputation as a strategist and leader had already been forged during the Battle of Britain, but Malta became his masterpiece. Under his guidance, the island's defence network evolved into a coordinated war machine, radar stations, observation posts and fighter patrols working seamlessly to maintain air superiority. The Axis commanders across the sea now faced an opponent who anticipated every move. The numbers told the story clearly. In August alone, the Luftwaffe lost over 100 aircraft in attempts to re-establish dominance over Malta. German and Italian pilots spoke of exhaustion and confusion, of missions launched with little hope of success. The skies that had once belonged to the Axis were now a gauntlet of danger, and those who ventured across it often failed to return. Malta's airfields, once symbols of desperation, had become launching points for victory. From these same runways, British and Allied bombers began striking deep into the Axis supply lines. The target was Rommel's lifeblood, his convoys crossing from Italy and Greece to North Africa. The results were immediate and devastating. Ships loaded with fuel, ammunition and reinforcements were intercepted and destroyed in the narrow waters south of Sicily. Each sinking meant fewer tanks, fewer trucks, and fewer soldiers reaching the desert front. By the time Rommel prepared for his next offensive in North Africa, his situation had become dire. The Afrika Korps, once famed for its mobility and precision, now found itself crippled by shortages. Tanks ran out of fuel in mid-battle, artillery units lacked shells, and infantry went hungry. The chain of cause and effect led directly back to Malta. Every bomb dropped from its aircraft, every torpedo launched from its submarines contributed to the gradual strangulation of Axis power in the region. In October 1942, this pressure reached its climax. At El Alamein, British forces under General Bernard Montgomery launched a massive counter-offensive that would drive Rommel's army into retreat. While desert warfare captured the headlines, the unseen foundation of that victory had been laid months earlier in Malta's skies. Historians would later agree the siege's outcome had tilted the balance of the entire Mediterranean war. The island had lived up to Churchill's words, an unsinkable aircraft carrier. For the people of Malta, however, victory carried a more personal meaning. The scars of war remained everywhere. Valletta's skyline was jagged where once it had been graceful. Entire districts were reduced to rubble. The population had endured hunger, disease, and relentless bombardment, yet their spirit had never broken. When peace finally settled, King George VI's earlier gesture took on even greater significance. The George Cross, awarded to the entire island for heroism and devotion, became not just a medal, but a symbol of collective sacrifice. The George Cross would later be incorporated into the flag of Malta, a permanent reminder of those years when the island's survival depended on the courage of its people and the pilots who fought above them. Every Maltese child born after the war would grow up under that emblem, a quiet testament to endurance and unity in the face of annihilation. Among the airmen, stories of bravery and camaraderie spread far beyond the island. George Buzz Burling became one of the most celebrated aces of the war. His kills over Malta, 27 confirmed within weeks, earned him both fame and infamy. Journalists dubbed him the Knight of Malta, while fellow pilots described him as part machine, part legend. Though restless and sometimes difficult, his precision and courage embodied the essence of the struggle. To this day, aviation historians speak his name with reverence when recounting the turning tide over the Mediterranean. Other pilots too carried memories that would never fade. Johnny Plagis, Stan Turner, and the men of 126, 185, and 249 squadrons all left their mark on the battle's story. Many did not live to see the final victory, yet their names filled the rosters of heroism. Their work had changed the course of the war, often at the cost of everything they had. The island's reconstruction began almost immediately after the siege ended. Engineers rebuilt harbours and roads, while masons restored the churches that had sheltered thousands during the worst of the bombardment. Every stone placed back into Valletta's walls was an act of defiance against the destruction that had once rained from the sky. When visitors from Britain and America arrived months later, they were stunned by the vitality of a people who had endured such devastation, yet greeted them with warmth and laughter. Malta's strategic value did not end with the lifting of the siege. Through 1943, its airfields and harbours became staging grounds for Allied operations that would ultimately expel the Axis from North Africa and invade Sicily. Squadrons that had once fought for survival now escorted bombers across the Mediterranean, their engines echoing triumph rather than desperation. The same cliffs that had witnessed terror now looked down upon victory fleets bound northward. By May 1943, the Axis surrender in North Africa was complete. Over 230,000 German and Italian troops laid down their arms, their supply lines cut, and their fleets shattered. Malta's contribution to that victory was immense. Its aircraft and submarines had sunk 230 Axis ships in just 5 months. The battle that began as a desperate defence had ended as a masterstroke of offensive warfare. In the years that followed, veterans of the siege often spoke of how Malta had changed them. Many described it as a crucible, an experience that burned away fear and forged something indestructible in its place. They remembered the dust-filled air of the shelters, the flash of sunlight on a Spitfire's wing, the smell of oil and cordite drifting over the sea. To them, Malta was more than a posting. It was a test of endurance that defined a generation. For historians, the Siege of Malta became one of the defining chapters of the Second World War, a moment when sheer willpower, tactical brilliance, and technological superiority converged to turn hopelessness into triumph. The struggle represented more than a military victory. It was proof that courage, discipline, and unity could prevail even against overwhelming odds. Today, standing on the cliffs overlooking the same harbours once cloaked in smoke, visitors can still sense the weight of history in the wind. The limestone bears scars from shrapnel, and the airfields, now quiet, still trace the outlines of the runways where Spitfires launched toward eternity. Each echo of the past speaks of a time when the fate of an empire rested on a few hundred pilots and an island too stubborn to die. The siege of Malta had been a battle of endurance, faith, and defiance. Its victory reshaped the Mediterranean War and inspired those who fought across the globe. When historians recount how the tide of the Second World War began to turn in favour of the Allies, they return again and again to that small island fortress and the men who defended it with steel wings and unbreakable hearts. The legacy of Malta endures not only in medals and memorials, but in the quiet dignity of its people, descendants of those who survived the darkest days of 1942. Their story remains a testament to what can be achieved when courage outweighs fear, when resolve defies destruction, and when a tiny island in a vast sea chooses to stand unyielding against the storm.